Deborah, she says she's ready. Okay, Rabbi Lori, whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Welcome. So nice to see so many faces. Terrific. We're so glad that you're with us this evening. So before I begin, I just want to welcome all of you. Really grateful that you took the time to be here and learn with us. My name is Rabbi Lori Rice from Congregation Micah here in Nashville. And I'm really grateful that Micah is one of many sponsors of this evening's event. We are co-sponsors with Nashville Hadassah, the National Council for Jewish Women, and the Jewish Federation of Nashville. So thank you so much to all of our sponsors for making this evening possible. I also want to thank my partners in crime, Deborah Olashansky and Leslie Kirby, and Michal as well, of course, who is behind the scenes on tech with us this evening for making this evening a reality. So I am truly honored to introduce somebody that I've probably held in great esteem and looked up to for many years now, a professor and rabbi from the Hebrew Union College, Carole Balin. And before I give you a little bit of her biography, I just want to say that Rabbi Dr. Balin was a professor at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. She still is, but she was when I was a seminary student. And that's just to say that one of the things that I and my fellow female classmates really loved about her was that she was just this young, brilliant, also beautiful, and just incredibly smart, classy rabbi on faculty. And so we just looked up to her as someone that we could learn from and aspire to be. And so now to have the opportunity to introduce her to all of you is truly just a pleasure and an honor. As a prolific writer and teacher, Rabbi Balin is known for her very fresh ideas, authenticity, and way with words. If you've had the opportunity to learn from her before or see any of her online teachings, you know this to be true. She is the first woman to earn tenure at the New York campus of her alma mater, the Hebrew Union College, my alma mater as well, where she is Professor Emerita of History. She is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Wellesley College, where she also earned a doctorate at Columbia University and honed her spiritual practice at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. She is the chair of the Jewish Women's Archive Board, and as such, she speaks and publishes widely on gender and the Jewish experience. Carole created a 9-part series on Jewish women suffragists for the Union of Reform Judaism's 10 Minutes of Torah, and she is currently at work on a narrative nonfiction book about shifting Jewish identity as told through the stories of bat mitzvah girls since the first one in the US in 1922. And in fact, if you think this is a really cool project, which it is, you can share your bat mitzvah story as well by going to, and we'll share this in the chat, www.carolebalin.com/bat mitzvah project. Carole currently lives in New York City with her husband, and it's very fun to note that her youngest of 3 children is a rising sophomore at Vanderbilt University and will be arriving here tomorrow. So without further ado, Carole, thank you so much for being with us and teaching us this evening.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be with you. And thank you, Rabbi Rice, for such a lovely introduction. It's been many years since we learned together in the classroom, but the feeling and affection has only grown over time. I also want to thank the other folks who have been involved in doing the work to make this evening flow smoothly, Leslie and Deborah and Michal. So thank you. I'm so excited to be in Nashville, even if it's remotely. As you heard, my son is coming tomorrow to start his sophomore year at Vandy. And I'm sorry that I can't be with him tomorrow and to be back in Nashville, but I will be there before you know it, before I know it probably. And I am going to take time this evening to talk about Nashville and Tennessee and its central role in the passage of the 19th Amendment, of course, which we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of this year. So I'm going to share my screen. I have lots of slides and things to show you. Some things, one of the first slides will be more familiar to you than it is to me, and that's why I want to get back down to Nashville to see it. But I'll leave that a little bit hidden. Let me just share my screen and bring up my slides, and we'll go from there. All right, voila. So we're, as I called this evening's talk, it's Jewish suffragists on the front line and how one Jewish woman changed everything in Tennessee. And as I said, we'll bracket tonight's presentation with Tennessee. So I'll start with Tennessee, I'll come back to Tennessee, and in the middle, I'm going to give you a taste of the way that Jewish women were involved in the suffragist movement 100 years ago, and even before that, and since then. So what I brought it to just set us up is to talk a little bit about how women play in the past. Rosa Sonnenschein, whose picture you see here, founded a magazine, the first Jewish magazine in English in the United States in 1895. And this is a picture of her in this kind of cotillion kind of Spanish flair. She said, not what has happened, but what's recorded makes history. And this has really been a guidepost for me. I actually wrote on her as an undergraduate, and she and her words are a guidepost for me because I want to record everything we can about women's past, because really that's all we know, right? So I've spent my career digging up stories, unearthing stories, and the suffragists, the Jewish women involved in the suffragist movement is another chapter in that book, so to speak. So not what has happened, but what's recorded. So I'm pushing it all out to you tonight so that we can keep on telling the story and making sure that it gets written down. The second quote I brought for you tonight is from Barbara Meyerhoff. Her quote here, everyone has a story. These stories told to oneself and others can transform the world. So Barbara Meyerhoff was an anthropologist. She worked at USC. She became head of the department there, and she started her research working on folks in developing nations, and then found herself one day following her Jewish roots, and she wound up in Venice, California, and she started to interview elderly Jewish people. And she started oral histories that have now proliferated. Before Steven Spielberg was doing it vis-a-vis Holocaust history, she was doing it for elderly people. And out of that, she created ethnography and the idea of interviewing people who are still alive to tell the tales of their lives. But I love this quote because it talks about how we see ourselves. Each of us has a narrative, and each of our narratives matter. And again, part of my work has been to turn over those narratives and to make them available and to make them known. So we start tonight with thinking about these stories and how they inspire us, how these women become role models for us, and how really when you start to see it, you can believe that you can be it. I think wherever we might stand politically, the announcement yesterday of the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, even seeing that image changes something. It evokes sort of into reality something that we hadn't known Monday. So if you can see it, you can be it. So I will tell you that in terms of seeing it and history, there are approximately 6,000 statues in this country from east to west, north to south, of historical figures. And of those 6,000 statues, only 10% are of women. So if you can see it, you can be it. I was just saying to my husband the other night, can you imagine, walking through life and imagine if, 5,500 of the statues were of women and only 500 were of men, how would that change your orientation? And he was kind of like a little blown away thinking about that. I live near Central Park in Manhattan, and of the 23 statues in Central Park, all of them are of men, that is of historical figures. There is one statue of a female, and that's Alice from Alice in Wonderland. So what does that say to us, right? What is that telling our girls? So I am proud to know that my son will be living in Nashville, has lived 6 months or so in Nashville before COVID brought him back home. But all of you folks there know the following statue that is in Centennial Park in Nashville. And I did a little learning myself. I've not seen this statue yet, and I plan to when I go back to Nashville. So this was mounted in 2016. I don't know how many of you have seen, I don't see all your faces, you can't raise your hand, but I would imagine most of the people on this call have seen this statue. I don't know if everybody on the call could identify the women on the statue, and I'm not going to quiz you, but I bring it because I love the idea that Nashville is making what you can see, you can be possible. So I just want to point out a few figures here. None of them are Jewish. The woman here on the left with the hat is most famous of the 5 figures. Her name is Carrie Chapman Catt. Carrie Chapman Catt, and I emphasize her because she's going to come back into our story at the end of the presentation when we come back to Tennessee after I talk about Jewish women suffragists. Carrie Chapman Catt was a national suffrage leader, and she came to Nashville to direct pro-suffragists from the Hermitage Hotel, which I guess is another important site on, for tourists who come to Nashville. Again, a place I haven't yet visited, but will. So Carrie Chapman is here. The woman beside her, it's funny, I couldn't find any way of identifying for sure which woman is which, even on plaques, but my guess, but looking from photographs, this tall woman in the front with the banner is Ann Dallas Dudley. She was born, all 4 of these women, Carrie is not born in Tennessee, but the other 4 women were all born in Tennessee. So this woman here, Ann Dallas Dudley of Nashville, the tall woman with the plaque, was very prominent in the suffrage movement in Tennessee on both a local and a national level. And what's really interesting about her, just in terms of you can see it, you can be it in appearance, she was a very beautiful woman. And what they did is they circulated pictures of her and her children, beautiful images of she and her children, to counteract stereotypes of suffragists as mannish radicals. So it's really interesting, just in terms of, today in politics and what women have to field versus what men do, and in terms of, sort of old stereotypes die hard. Another person here, I think it's this woman on the right back, is a woman also born in Nashville in 1864. Her name is Juno Frankie Pierce. She went by J. Frankie Pierce or Frankie Pierce. She was an American educator and suffragist, and she helped get 2,500 Black women to register to vote in 1919 in Nashville's municipal election. It was the first time in 1919 before national suffrage, but Nashville, a year before the country, allowed women and Black women per se to vote in elections, which is remarkably early. So that's Juno Frankie Pierce. She went on to found a vocational school in Nashville. And what's really important to note again about Nashville in terms of its progressiveness and forward thinking, unlike the rest of the country, for the most part, Black women were segregated and were not part of the national suffrage women's movements. Untrue though, in Nashville, there was a separate Black women's suffrage organization and a white women's organization, but they joined forces and they worked together on various social issues. And the artist, the sculptor who made this sculpture, depicts that in the back row. Two of the women are holding hands. J. Frankie Juneau, who's Black, and one of the white women. So I found that really interesting in terms of aspirational sculpture and what it can bring to our lives and being an inspiration. So our story. We turn tonight to Jewish women who were involved in the suffrage movement. The suffrage movement, or the road to the passage of the 19th Amendment, was long. If you were to ask me when it all started, I would turn to 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, upstate New York, in 1848, when there was the first women's rights convention that was held. That's where sort of the, when we think about the suffrage movement today, the names that are flashpoints, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that's their generation of women. They held this women's rights convention. Frederick Douglass came to speak. It was mainly women, but Frederick Douglass, of course, a Black abolitionist, came to speak. And this was the first attempt in this country to rally the cause of women, to bring women together. And again, I sound like a tourist, like a tour guide tonight, but Seneca Falls, New York today has a very lovely women's history museum and some of the artifacts from that era. So the road to the passage of the amendment began in 1848. The amendment itself, that is, that women should get the national vote, was first proposed in 1878. So 30 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, there's a first proposal that this amendment be put out. It takes until 1919, so what is that, roughly 40 years, for the amendment to pass the House, the US House, and then the US Senate. That's in 1919, but even then its fate was in doubt, because as you know, for an amendment, it requires 3/4 of the state to ratify it. At that time, 36 states needed to ratify this amendment in order for it to be passed. And I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that Tennessee was responsible for being the 36th state to ratify this and to bring it into law. So we'll come back to that part of the story at the very end, and the role that a Jewish woman played in that piece of the history. The main takeaways I want to put out to you tonight are three. One is, not depicted in the slide necessarily, but the first is that Jewish women got involved in the suffrage movement, a secular cause, but often on the basis of their Jewish values. And I'm going to bring that home to you in the few examples of women I bring in just a few minutes. But it wasn't a Jewish issue per se, right? It was an American issue that women brought to bear, Jewish women brought to bear their Jewish values. Second point I want to make to you is the geographic diversity of Jewish women's involvement in the suffrage movement. Excuse me. So much of Jewish history is New York centric. I'm actually from Boston originally. Have learned about Southern history since I took up history as a profession. But so much of Jewish history is New York centric, maybe, you could argue along the Eastern Seaboard. But what's really lovely about this story is that it passes through across the country. And I'm going to highlight some of those women for you in just a few minutes. But in terms of our map here, Maud Nathan, I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, from New York. Rose Schneiderman is another one from New York. Pauline Perlmutter Stein, I'm going to get to in just a minute, from Ohio. Belle Fliegelman Weinstein from Montana. You don't often see Jews figuring into Montanan history, or people from Montana into Jewish history, I should say. Here, a woman born in Nevada, Miriam Michelson, who became a reporter and involved in the suffrage movement. And then into the South, we have, I don't know if Maryland's considered the South if you live in Nashville, but we have Marguerite Bishop, Rosette Bishop, I'll talk about in just a minute, and Gertrude Weil I'll talk about, and Anita Politzer. So it's a broad spectrum in terms of the way the geographic spread. I will mention in Tennessee itself, we're going to talk about Anita Politzer, who will have an effect on Tennessee at the end of the day and the end of our evening. But Jenny Lowenheim Lusky I learned from a Jewish Federation National newsletter, just put out a few days ago. I don't know how many of you saw it, but I wanted to just dip my toe a little bit into what was going on at this time in Tennessee. And Jenny Lowenheim-Lusky, whose father, apparently Joseph Lowenheim, was attacked by the KKK. He was actually strung up in a tree and left to die. And he had the presence of mind to give what was known as the Masonic stress signal, the Masonic Lodge fraternity organization, which some of the KKK members recognized, and they cut him down from the tree and he saved his own life. So his daughter, I don't know how much the father's experience figured into her activism, but his daughter, Jenny, marched in a suffrage parade on May 1st, 1915, put together by one of those women in the statue that I referred to earlier, the woman in the front. She was a member, Jenny Lowenheim-Lusky was a member of the Equal Suffrage Association, whose slogan was heads high, feeling strong, united in purpose, confident in our cause. So that I just was thrilled to see that little bit of a write-up in terms of the involvement of a Jewish woman in Tennessee. So I want to go to our first woman we're going to cover in depth a little bit more than I have available right now on Jenny, but I'd love to learn more about her, and please feel free to send me information you may have about her at a later point. So Pauline Perlmutter Steinem is our first woman I want to go into with a little bit more depth. So Pauline Perlmutter Steinem, it turns out, is the grandmother of Gloria Steinem. Pauline Perlmutter Steinem was not only her sisterhood president of her local Reform synagogue in Toledo, Ohio, but she was a suffragist. The uncanny thing here is that Gloria Steinem herself didn't even know about this history of her grandmother, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So Pauline was born in Poland in 1866. Her parents were Bertha and Haman Perlmutter. Her father was a cantor. And she was trained a little bit unusually for Jewish women in Eastern Europe. We tend to think of them as, either balabustas, with the kerchief on their head and sort of old fashioned, or anarchists like Emma Goldman. But that's not really the case. This is like, I could give a whole other lecture on this. Is what my first passion is about women in Eastern Europe, Jewish women in Eastern Europe under the Tsars. But Pauline is one of those more exceptional women where she went to Bavaria and she trained as a teacher. And along comes this man named Leo Steinem, who's from Toledo, Ohio. He winds up in the Prussian Empire. He meets Pauline. The two fall in love. They get married in 1884. And after their first son is born, they move back to the United States, to Leo's hometown of Toledo. In the meanwhile, Pauline has 3 more sons. So she's a total of 4 sons. And her youngest son is Gloria Steinem's father. So all Gloria Steinem really knows about her grandmother, she hears a little bit from her own mother, who, by the way, is not Jewish and marries this Jewish man. But Pauline's grandmother, Gloria's grandmother, died when Gloria was 5. So she doesn't have that strong a memory of her. She called her Grandma Eni, Pauline, Grandma Eni. And she knew that she was a homemaker. She knew that she was involved in some Jewish activities. Well, it wasn't just some activities, it turns out. Probably like many people on this call, she was involved in 101 other different organizations. So she was president of the Jewish Free Loan Association, which was a first for women in the state. She was involved with the city section of the National Council of Jewish Women, and I know some of you are on the line tonight. She was an ardent feminist, and she worked for the suffrage movement. And when people asserted that women can't succeed in certain fields, she said, how do you know what women can do when we have never yet allowed them to try? So she went on to become a very ardent suffragist, feminist. She traveled to Switzerland in 1908 as one of 2 delegates to the International Council of Women, which was this worldwide women's advocacy group. She was president of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association, and she would write to the local chapters urging them to go to their local congresspeople to get them to vote for the suffrage amendment. In 1912, when the amendment failed, for the first time, she marched with thousands of women in the suffrage parade in DC, which took place the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president. And it reminds me of the Pink Hatters, right, who were in Washington in January 2017. Ohio became the 5th state to ratify the 19th Amendment on June 16th, 1919. So the code of this story is that Gloria Steinem, it turns out no one knew much about Pauline Perlmutter Steinem. Again, that what is recorded makes history, not what has happened, but what is recorded. So what happened is in the 1980s, early 1990s, as feminism starts to have an impact on Jewish history, feminist historians begin digging up Jewish women from the past that we didn't know of. And one day, Gloria Steinem gets a phone call saying, would you be willing to write an encyclopedia article for what's called the Jewish Women's Encyclopedia? And Gloria said she didn't know anything about her. She didn't know anything about her being a suffragist. And she learned through these feminist historians. And then Gloria Steinem was so proud and went on to write this article about her grandmother and her suffrage work. So it's really, really interesting. Again, about the need for these stories to proliferate. The second woman I want to introduce you to is Belle Fliegelman Weinstein. She is pictured here in an outfit that she wore. This is in front of, this was at the University of Wisconsin, where she went as a student. She was born in 1891 in Helena, Montana, but she spent her college years at the University of Wisconsin, and she was this president of the women's student government. They were divided men's and women's, and she was the head of the women's student government. And as such, she was invited to speak before the Congress, the state Congress, when she was a senior. And this is what she wore. This is the outfit she wore, which is so flapperish, right? You get the ambiance of the era, in seeing this slide. So she was born, as I said, in 1891, and she wrote a really lovely memoir that describes her suffragist involvement. And in the memoir, she describes how her stepmother was horrified by Belle's unladylike behavior. She would go give stump speeches on street corners, and her stepmother did not think that was appropriate for a girl or a young woman in Ohio, in Montana, at the turn of the century. So she was not even 5 feet tall, and she was born in 1891. Both her parents were immigrants from Romania, and she was guided in her civic engagement by her Jewish upbringing, and in the belief that God is the idea of goodness. God is the idea of goodness, and that was the push that got her involved in her civic engagement. When she was a young girl, a toddler, her mother died. Her mother's name was Minnie, and Belle's father, as I mentioned before, remarried. She had a stepmother, and her father had a dry goods store in Helena. Again, Helena isn't usually on the map of Jewish history. You don't even think of it, but I think it's wonderful. One of these frontier stories, like a Levi Strauss kind of story. So her father had a dry goods company, a store. He called it the New York Dry Goods Company, even though it was in Helena. And she went to public school. Belle went to public school along with her sister Frida. Her sister Frida went on to become an anthropologist. It sounds like a theme here, but she went on to become an anthropologist and went to Columbia University. And Belle, like I said, went to the University of Wisconsin. She had a degree in journalism, and she worked for a short stint as a reporter, first in New York and then Milwaukee, and then she returned to Helena to write for the local newspaper. And over the course of her life, she was quite prolific. She wrote children's stories, she wrote poetry, she wrote plays, she appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, and she decided eventually to abandon writing for politics. And she jumps into the movement, the suffrage movement, with 2 feet. And she, besides giving the stump speeches that her stepmother found inappropriate, she drove horse and buggy. I'm like trying to picture this, right? She drove horse and buggy to gold mining and ranching communities to get the word out about passing the 19th Amendment. She paraded down what's known as the Last Chance Gulch, which is the main thoroughfare of Helena, and she wrote for the Montana Suffrage Daily News. In 1914, that's 6 years before national suffrage, in 1914, the Montana state government ratified the 19th Amendment, and the women got the vote in 1914 in Montana, 6 years before nationally. And Belle went on to DC. She teamed up with a woman named Jeanette Rankin from Missoula, Montana, who decided to run for Congress. And Belle became her campaign manager. And Jeanette Rankin won the election and was the first woman to serve in the House of Representatives. And Belle followed her to DC. And once there, Belle met her husband-to-be, Norman Weinstein, maiden name Fliegelman Weinstein. Just a cute little story. Norman worked for Hoover's wartime food administration. And as part of his job, they would get pies, fruit pies brought to the food administration to taste them, to inspect them, to make sure they had no wheat in them, because that was a very valuable commodity between the wars and during the wars. So he would take the leftover pies and he would bring them to Belle, and he courted her, and they wound up marrying, and they moved back to Montana, and he became involved in the family business. Throughout her life, she was active in suffrage, in women's causes. She was active in the League of Women Voters. She became a lobbyist, a self-appointed lobbyist for child labor laws and for women to serve on juries. And at the age of 83, before she died, she said, I never go to the polls without a silent thank you to those many energetic, earnest women in Montana and other states who made it possible. So I just love that, she died in 1985, and she's still, honoring the memory of her own activism and those of other women. So that is Belle. I think, let's see, I'm going to pass on this slide. Let me just tell you what it is. And I saw somebody wearing it on their lapel not too long ago. You can buy these commercially from the Smithsonian or wherever. These were given as an honorific to women who were imprisoned on behalf of women's suffrage. If there was something called there was an urn put out in front of, this is again during Wilson's tenure in the presidency during his term, women would, protest in front of the White House with signs, but they also burned like a ner tamid in Judaism, like an eternal flame. And they took Wilson's old speeches and they threw them on the pyre, and they had this burning urn going, and some of them were arrested for doing that. So this was the pin that was given, for those women who served time in jail, 5 days, 7 days, 30 days, 6 months, whatever it might be. And there was a woman, I'm passing by her just for time's sake, but from Maryland, Marguerite Rosette Bichow, and she was awarded one of these pins because indeed she was thrown in jail for her activism on behalf of suffrage. Gertrude Weil, I want to spend just a few minutes with you on her. She is in the far left in this picture. I love this picture. It's like if I were to stage a picture of what I want suffragists to look like, this is what it would be. And what's so charming, I don't know if you can see, there's a man in the front. And it says on his poster here, Battalion for Male Sympathizers. And do you see what he's holding? He's holding a doll. He's holding a baby. So it's just so, we think so often of, we associate suffragists with women, but there were in fact men, and I'll speak about a man involved in just a moment. But Gertrude Weil, again, the woman on the far left here, she again was one of those Jewish suffragists whose activism was rooted in Jewish values. And for her, she said, justice, mercy, and goodness, which is a quote from Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. Justice, mercy, and goodness, she said, were not to be held in a vacuum, but practiced in our daily lives. So, and she did. This is what she did. She took every act.
What do you mean when it's your microphone?
Oh, I think we're Okay, thank you. So she took this to heart. Justice, mercy, and goodness should play a role in her everyday acts. So she is from the South. She's from North Carolina, from Goldsboro, North Carolina. She was raised in a Reformed Jewish family. Her family had been in the United States since the Civil War. And her grandparents helped found the local Congregation Oheb Shalom in Goldsboro, North Carolina. She attended religious school. Her family observed Jewish holidays. She taught at the Sunday school. She conducted adult Bible study, and she was the president of her sisterhood. All this in Goldsboro, North Carolina, small town to start, and even you can imagine smaller Jewish population. And she was also the founding member of Goldsboro's Hadassah chapter. I wanted to get that in. I know, again, one of the sponsors tonight is Hadassah. So along with her mother, she founded the local Goldsboro, North Carolina Hadassah chapter, and she served as president of the local and regional groups. She was also the president of the National North Carolina Association of Jewish Women. She sat on the board of the North Carolina Home for the Jewish Aged. She worked for the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. She helped to rescue refugees after World War II later in her life. And Judaism was for her a religion of daily life. Her parents, it's really interesting to me, her parents, Henry and Mina, prized a girl's education. She went to the public schools in Goldsboro. And then at the age of 16, she was sent to New York, and she went to the famous Horace Mann School, named for the famous educator, a co-ed high school. And she taught at the laboratory of the Columbia Teachers College. And her mother insisted that she write home letters, 3 letters a week. Now we're texting 3 times a day with our kids, but Gertrude wrote her mother 3 times a week. And in the letters are such a rich source for historians. She talks about her study. She talks about how she participated in sports. She talks about how she volunteered at the kindergarten for poor kids. And after she graduated from Horace Mann, she went to Smith College. She's the first woman from North Carolina to attend Smith College. And at Smith, she becomes interested and notices these independent women, as she says, who are defying traditional norms of female behavior. And by the time she graduates in 1901, she calls herself an avowed suffragist. So 1901, right, we're talking, very earlier on in this fight for the 19th Amendment. In 1914, she goes back at the turn of the century, after she graduates from college, she goes back to Goldsboro, and she helps found the Goldsboro Equal Suffrage Association, despite her mother's opposition. I'm going to talk in a moment about the opposition. Not every woman was in favor of suffrage. Gertrude founded the Suffrage Association in Goldsboro. She became its first president. And in 1919, she became president of the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League. And she worked very closely with Carrie Chapman Catt, who I showed in that statue, the woman in the front with the hat. And Gertrude traveled from state to state to gain support for the suffrage movement, suffrage amendment. North Carolina defeated the 19th Amendment by 2 votes. And it took until 1971 for women, for the 19th Amendment to pass, to ratify the amendment in the General Assembly of North Carolina. 3 weeks after the suffrage amendment passed in North Carolina, Gertrude Weil died in the home where she was born. So in terms of, I alluded before about not everybody was on board with the suffrage movement. And the best example of that are the 2 sisters, Maud Nathan on the left here, the elder sister, and Annie Nathan Meyer on the right, the younger sister. They were born into a notable New York Jewish family. They were 8th generation American Jews. They were descended from Sephardim who had settled in this country before the War of Independence in 1776. One of their relatives was involved in George Washington's inauguration. They were related to Benjamin Cardozo, the Chief Justice, and to the poet Emma Lazarus. Maud on the left was married at 17 years old to her 35-year-old cousin. It's like a Roosevelt kind of scenario. She was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she lived her life as a society woman. They lived in New York City. They summered in Saratoga Springs, north of the city. And her only child, Annette Florence Nathan, died in 1895 as a girl. And Maud Nathan then threw herself into social justice work and political activism. And besides working to expose poor working conditions of women, she became president of the New York Consumers League, and she worked tirelessly for suffrage alongside her husband. He led the Men's League for equal suffrage, like that man seated. That's not him in the photo I showed you before, but as I said, Maud's husband was very involved. And in newspaper accounts, he was referred to as Mr. Maud Nathan. Annie, on the other hand, sister, the younger sister, after Maud left to marry Nathan, Maud Nathan, I'm sorry, her husband, Annie took over the household, and she started to create a reading circle, and she became very interested in women's organizations and women's learning, and she helped found Barnard College. And even given her her activism on behalf of women's education, she was against the suffrage movement. She believed that it would be hard. It would make women lose their privileges, she thought, some of the privileges they had. She thought they'd lose their respect in society if they could vote like men. Eventually, she will come on board once the amendment is passed. So you can imagine their family satyrs, and they called them the Suffs and the Aunties, the Suffs and the Aunties in this one family. So finally, I wanted to go back to Tennessee, and then I'll end and we'll take questions. So last story about Tennessee. We are almost at the 100th anniversary, quite literally. Today's what, the 13th. In 5 days will be the 100th anniversary of the final dramatic showdown over the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, which played out in Tennessee, in your state capital. So what happened is the Senate approved the amendment, and then it went to the House in Tennessee. The House was all male, as you can imagine. And many of the men wore their opinion on their sleeve, so to speak, or on their lapel. If you believed in suffrage, you would wear a yellow rose. And if you were against it, you wore a red rose. So here you have Harry Byrne. He's 24 years old. He's the youngest legislator in Tennessee's Congress. There were 96 of them gathered together on August 18th. Half of them were wearing a red rose, half of them were wearing a yellow rose. And they kept voting, and they kept tying, and they couldn't even bring the vote to the floor. Finally, they decided they have to bring this to a vote, and they begin the roll call, and they're at 45, 44, and it comes Harry's turn. Well, it turns out Harry Byrne had received a letter from his mother. And in the pocket of his suit jacket was this letter, as you see, addressed to the Honorable Harry T. Burns in Nashville, state capital. And his mother, whose name is Feb Byrne, lived in another part of the state, not in Nashville. And she wrote him a letter that he received. You can see August 17th, 2:30 a.m., 1920, the day before this historic election ballot. And she writes all these updates about what's going on at home on the farm. And she slips in references to her desire for him to pass this amendment, to vote in favor of it. And I mean, it's very hard to read here, but the letter was 6 pages long. This is page 6. On page 2, she writes, "Hurrah, and vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt." And another page, she says, "I hope you see enough of politicians to know it's not one of the greatest things to be one. What say you?" She's putting down politicians. And this is the last page. And you can sort of see, it says, "Write, mother, every time you have a chance, for I am always looking for a letter when you are away. Don't forget," I'm gonna read it off my notes here. "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Cat, right? That's Carrie Chapman, Cat. I showed you her in your statue there in Centennial Park. Be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Cat with her rats. Is she the one that put rat in ratification? No more from Mama this time, with lots of love, Mama. So she sends this letter the day before the vote. He keeps it in his pocket, and sure enough, he votes for the amendment. However, there's another story about a Jewish woman named Anita Politzer. Anita Politzer, born in 1894 in Charleston, South Carolina, which happens to be the birthplace, by the way, of Reform Judaism in this country. And she's the fourth child of first-generation Americans. So Anita Politzer, born in 1894 in Charleston, South Carolina, and she's a second-generation American. She teaches at the Sabbath school, at the local synagogue, Kahal Kodesh Beth Elohim. She publishes this article about women in law. In 1912, she goes to New York City and she gets a degree in teaching at Columbia's Teacher College. She majors in art and education. She becomes friendly with Georgia O'Keeffe, the artist, and she introduces Georgia O'Keeffe's work. She takes a little notebook of Georgia O'Keeffe's watercolors and shows it to Alfred Stieglitz, the great photographer, and he gets an interest in Georgia O'Keeffe, and Anita helps promote Georgia O'Keeffe's, what will become preeminent career. And also she becomes involved in the suffrage movement, Anita Politzer in New York, and she meets up with Alice Paul. Alice Paul, ironically, and admit it's ironic, she's the head of the National Women's Party, a very prominent figure in the suffrage movement. Alice Paul is known to be an anti-Semite, but for whatever reason, these women get along, and maybe there's more to know about what Alice Paul's beliefs were or not. In 1917, she joins Alice Paul and becomes one of the silent sentinels I described before of protesting in front of the White House, picketing the White House. She's arrested, she's thrown in jail. So in 1920, just as this vote is about to happen in Tennessee, the National Women's Party sends Anita Politzer down to Nashville because she's known for her powers of persuasion. And she is deployed to Tennessee by the National Women's Party to have dinner with Harry T. Byrne the night before the vote. And the following day, he casts this critical vote, making Tennessee the final and decisive state, the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And history, feminist historians today credit her with his change of heart, not the mother, but this woman who came the night before. So I will end here. This is a picture of Anita after the vote passed. Anita Politzer with W.J. Jamison, who was the chairman of the National Finance Committee, and they're looking over to check that the amendment had indeed passed. So I will stop there. There's a lot of, this is my own slide, there's a lot of exciting pieces to pick up, and I'm happy to take your questions, learn from you, and carry on.
Dr. Balin, thank you so much. That was amazing. We could continue to learn from you all night, I think. We do have some questions that have come in, so I'll just sort of toss them your way, and we may get some more along the way. And I just want to say that I remember learning from you a really wonderful story. I don't know if you'll remember this webinar where you taught about the ERA and how it impacted the early female reform rabbis when the CCAR, when our rabbinic conference was meant to be in Arizona, which was not yet a ratifying state, and how Rabbi Laura Geller, who was our scholar in residence for the entire fall at Congregation Micah with our women's group, called on her childhood friend, Jonathan Friedan, Betty's son. That was such a terrific webinar. Anyway, so I know a lot of your work is linked together, but I always love learning from you.
That's the Equal Rights Amendment, which of course is the next thing, right? Which we're still trying to fight for.
Yes, right, exactly. Well, that'll be part 2 of this session with you. So, all right. So first question that came in is from one of our community members, Avi Poster, who's on the call. And Avi asked, how did these incredible women stay in touch with each other and coordinate their work? Imagine the damage they could have done if they had had the internet and email. But how did they make this happen together?
It's, it's true of any kind of news, right? In that era, what did they use? Radio, telegram, telegraph. It was very primitive compared to our own day today. Newspapers, but even that took time, right? That's why when we talk about the import of reporters and female reporters, right, getting the story out. But it's a great question. I mean, a lot of history is played out along train lines, in the 19th century, right? History is made through, where you can take a stop and then, tell a story. So it's a great question, but it's true of all history, right? Pre Facebook or pre.
I mean, a lot of us probably can't remember what it was like to communicate without instant communication, and yet we did it. So
right. And the other thing too is it's a really important point too in terms of understanding culture today, where you don't have to go to Moscow to understand what Moscow looks like, right? You can zoom into the Sudan, you can zoom into even 6 miles away from you, but our global perspective, right, has made the world shrink in a way that it wouldn't have. And it's really interesting to contemplate. Once any important announcement is made anywhere, that it's almost instantaneous that somebody finds out, and that's both for the good. I think mainly for the good as a historian, for sure, but also it has repercussions for backlash and that kind of thing. But it's a good question. Thank you.
So I just wanted to kind of say for everybody out there that the Nashville Ballet 72 Steps, which is an artistic interpretation of this history that we've been learning about tonight, is now available to be seen virtually. We were meant to have it live at our Women's Seder this year, our community Women's Seder with the Temple and Micah, and we're obviously unable to do so, but you can access that live, which I highly recommend, and to appreciate our own Nashville Ballet. And then one of our community members, Felicia Anker, posted that Alice Paul's anti-Semitism had kept other Jewish women out of the movement. Is that your understanding as a historian as well?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's really interesting because this friendship with Anita Politzer is, doesn't square with that. But there was anti-Semitism in the suffragist movement. Alice Paul is known for that. In the same way, later on in the 1970s with second wave feminism, there is rabid anti-Semitism, I'm afraid, as well. Even several years ago with the Women's Parade, right?
I was just going to say, we see this intersectionality, this conversation around intersectionality all the time, and we see with the Black Lives Matter movement too. So it seems to be something that comes around. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no. I agree with you 100%. No, and I like the conversation, the back and forth. I think it's appealing. Thank you. I think too, it's important to note that Black women were left out of the suffrage movement. Black women didn't get suffrage
Right.
in 1920. That was the beginning of their fight, not the end of it. Like for white women, Ida B. Wells was told when she marched in. A Black woman was told when she showed up to march in 1919 in Washington, she was told to go to the back of the parade, back of the march, and she actually filtered her way up to the front with the Illinois representative. So it's a very shameful part of the history, but it's there, and we need to confront it.
Well, I had this moment, you could call it a woke moment. I mean, I think we all like to think of ourselves as sort of progressive woke Jews, those of us who are Jewish on this webinar, which I think most of us are, many of us are. And I called Leslie Kirby sometime late in the evening and said, oh my gosh, we're doing this whole program around suffrage and the right to vote for women, but it was the right to vote for white women. And we can't just focus on that at this time. But I want to kind of go a little bit more macro, if we can, for a moment, and take advantage of the fact that you are a historian in your DNA, in your core. And, there's so much conversation now about the history we were taught versus the history that actually was. And to your point about one of your earlier quotes about, the story that's recorded. And I just wonder, whether it's about the experience of Black people in America, the experience of Jews in America, suffrage, whatever it might be. I mean, how do you see history, how it's taught, how it's extended to others, to the next generation? How do you see that changing, if at all, in our country?
Well, I mean, I think you mentioned intersectionality, and you could almost argue that about history too, right? We're broadening the subject matter. We're broadening who gets recorded. And that happens when we hear the voices, right? And when we learn about the material. you could go way back and, it was the literate people whose stories got told, right? Because if it wasn't written down, what do you use, right? So if you have a population that's illiterate, they're more likely to be forgotten. That's why I brought up the Barbara Meyerhoff quote in the beginning. I mentioned she's the anthropologist who did the oral histories. And, there's validity given now to oral histories that were not necessarily the case. In a lot of my work, I've done what I call a backdoor approach. I was naysayed by my advisors. I mean, way back when I was a grad student, oh, you'll never find stuff about women in Eastern Europe. They didn't exist. They existed, but we don't have any of their works. Well, there's newspapers, there's learning languages other than, the obvious ones like Hebrew. I mean, yeah, women didn't learn Hebrew, but they knew Russian. So, their works were in the Yiddish press or in the Russian press. Right. So you have to be a little bit like Sherlock Holmes, to sort of get at this. I think also, history, I'd like to think history is getting a better rap than it used to because it's becoming more inclusive. It's making people feel more attached to it. One of my raison d'etres for writing my 9-part series on the suffragists, I was asked to write on a book of the Bible, one of the Torah, one of the 5 books. And I said, well, okay, I'll do it. Only if you'll let me write on the book of Numbers, which is all about census and who gets counted. And if you count it up, the 635,000 men are counted up in the book, and fewer than 5 women are mentioned. So I said, I'll do a book. I'll write on the book of Numbers, but I want to write an alternative book of Numbers, and I want it to be about Jewish women suffragists, and they let me do it. But sort of the entree has to open as well. And that comes with the proliferation of more people who care about telling a more inclusive story.
To that point, I thought your comment about statues and the percentage of statues that are female in our country, and yet that we have such a prominent, powerful one in Centennial Park, which we're also grateful for. And it made me think about, sort of the bookmarking of the women in the book of Exodus, and how really these women made everything that happens happen, but they are not credited with having been sort of the movers and the shakers in the way that we know them to have been. So one of our participants tonight, Frances Cutler-Hahn, asked if the women that you spoke about this evening, were they mostly, I don't know if reform is the right term to use, were they reform, were they progressive? I mean, were there more religious women? And because one of the comments I thought that was really interesting that you made was that for a lot of these women, their Jewish values brought them to the cause of suffrage. And I think today, for a lot of us, our Jewish values bring us to a number of causes. And yet sometimes that can be diluted to, I'm a Jew because I protest here. So back to Frances's question, what was their affiliation, if anything, or their religious observance?
That's a really great question. First of all, the pool of women we know of who were Jewish and outwardly Jewish and involved in the suffrage movement is small. And even smaller than that are the ones who come with a religious inflection of any sort. It so happens, like Gertrude Weil, I mentioned, she comes from Charleston, South Carolina, which is the bedrock of Reform Judaism. So she definitely came out of that tradition. And she knew that the Reform movement early on, and as early as 1848, there was a promise in the Reform movement to make women have religious equal status on a religious level with men. That promise is still not fulfilled, in my opinion. But so there are some women like that. There were also secular women who were involved. I didn't bring anybody up like that tonight, but Rose Schneiderman, who was very, very involved after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1907, she got involved in politics for women and then also suffrage. But she had nothing to do with religion at all whatsoever, which was very common for the Yiddishists that came out of New York of that era. Yeah. There were more traditional women, and I will tell you, there was a boycott of the kosher meat market, of kosher butchers on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in, I want to say 1907. It's either 1907 or 1911, but I think it's 1907, where traditional women, women who were keeping kosher home, boycotted the kosher meat markets, and they went and protested in front of them. There was even a stone thrown into the window of a kosher butcher because they were raising the meat prices exorbitantly, and it didn't square with whatever and they were the ones buying it, right? They were the consumer, and it worked, and it brought the prices down. So these are traditional women who are not politicized, who are not marching for whatever was happening in 1907, in this country, but they staged their own boycott. That, by the way, an article that was written on that by Paula Hyman, who is deceased, but she was the doyen of American Jewish women's history. And with that article, she opened up, it's amazing. Even when I tell the story now, I've heard it 15 times, right? But it's so interesting to imagine, who would have thought to focus on the kosher meat market boycott? And the reason that Paula found this is because somebody had written in an editorial in, I think it was the New York Times, though I could be the wall, maybe Washington Post, about the imagery used in the kosher meat boycott about Jews. And Paula read this and said, wait, women were boycotting? So out of that, it ballooned into this whole story and really, turned Jewish women's history into something, something that got on the books.
So let me ask you, and I am cognizant of our time. Well, first of all, folks want to know more about your book project, the Numbers book project. So if you could talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to go back really quickly to this subject of Jewish values and current and past activism, because I think a lot of our community members, and I know some people on this call, because we've talked about it as recently as yesterday, really struggle with, we want to be active in social change. And in order to do that, we need to partner with others who are active in social change. And yet sometimes, coming back to this word of intersectionality, we don't always align, corner to corner, like a fitted sheet. And yet, what is your sense? I feel like a lot of these women, Jewish women who put a lot on the line, really believed that what they were doing was like praying with their feet, just living out their sort of prophetic understanding of what it meant to be Jewish. And how, I guess, where do you see the line of working for social change, living out your Jewish values, and sometimes working with others who may not always see eye to eye on every issue that you see?
Right. I think it's a really good question, and I am grateful for the question and grateful for the whole notion of intersectionality. It's a term that it's new to me. I have a 22-year-old daughter, and she teaches me much more, about feminism today. I know about the past more than she does, but I appreciate what intersectionality is saying is that we're multidimensional creatures. And, I'm a woman, and I'm a Jew, and I'm from the Northeast, and I'm a mother, and I'm a professor, right? I hold all these different identities. And even in my own self, they don't always cohere. Right. And that's what sort of, right. I'm drawn to some things, but then I push back because I need another part of my personality it doesn't cohere with. And I think that's sort of that's like the organism of social activism is what we're seeing, that it's multidimensional. And that's what intersectionality is teaching us, that one oppression is not worse than another necessarily, but we have to look at sort of the whole prism of oppression that's going on. So I'm learning as I go. I think the Women's March was a real backlash against Jews. Jewish women felt really stung by wanting to be part of that, but then feeling like there was anti-Semitism, like a tipping one's hat among some of the leaders to Farrakhan, for example. And that, I just want to run screaming the other way, right? So I think it's a balance, and I think it's a case-by-case basis. And I think it also depends on who we're working with.
And I think it's also a message that you can be really open-minded and expanded on one issue and not really understand another at all.
Yeah.
I feel like it's really small and diminished and easily turned in black and white. So I think that's.
But if we run away and abandon it, then we never get to educate people who disagree with us. So
yeah, give up your seat at the table.
Yeah. I got it with my son going to school in Nashville. Quite honestly, he chose to get out of the New York bubble and get out of the New England area, New York, Northeast, because he wanted to challenge himself and not just hang back and be among the people who think just like him. So
Well, Carole, you need to tell him that he needs to come to Williamson County and we'll give him a little bit of a different education here. He's still in Metro. That's different. But, you know, one of our fellow female rabbis on this call, Jessica Schimberg, just sort of noted, which I think is important, that despite the reform movement's roots in equality between men and women, it was actually the Reconstructionist movement that first brought egalitarian language to prayer. And it's important that we keep our minds expanded to the larger tent of North American Judaism.
100%, because their whole theology was so much more open and accepting and egalitarianism.
Yeah. I think I might have hit all of our questions that kind of came in. So maybe do you want to tell us a little bit more about your Numbers Book project and the Bat Mitzvah project, and we'll kind of wrap up with that?
Sure. So the Suffragist Project, as I said, it's a 9-part series where I wrote an alternative book of numbers where women are counted. And each week for 9 weeks over the course of the book of numbers, was that Flip who just went by? Hello.
Yes.
I taught him years ago too.
Yeah.
Welcome. You were great. Great. Best teacher. No, all the girls looked up to you. The guys had crushes on you.
I was appropriate.
Okay. So the book of numbers. So I wrote this alternative book of numbers, and each week I featured another suffragist, and 4 or 5 of them I mentioned tonight. So I think, you know, it's on the URJ website if you want to take a look. They're 1,000 words each. They're a shorter thing. I may turn that into someday, actually, a young adult nonfiction to be used in schools. I think that would be fun.
Okay.
But my main project I'm working on right now is my bat mitzvah book. I call them my bat mitzvah girls. Bat mitzvah is turning 100 in 2022. The first one was on March 18th, 1922 in New York City. Judith Kaplan, who was this daughter of Mordechai Kaplan, Reconstructionist rabbi, created Reconstructionism. And he always said he had 4 reasons for creating bat mitzvah. Judith, his eldest, Selma, Naomi, and Hadassah. You know, he had 4 reasons. He had 4 daughters, no sons. And out of that first attempt came now millions of girls, right, who followed in Judith Kaplan's footsteps. And what I'm doing is I'm capturing the stories of bat mitzvah girls over the decades and writing up a narrative using their voices, telling the story of how Jewish girls changed everything in this country. 50 years before the first woman rabbi in this country, girls were up on that bima, you know, being involved in the service, and how that changed. Like, you know, like I keep saying, the way you envision things, it matters. So I'm really excited about it. I would love stories. I have a website, carolebalin.com, and on that is a bat mitzvah page. You can like click.
And it's in your chat, everyone.
Thank
and
you.
I just want to point out, because, you know, I'm not sure how many of us know, especially those of you who are either affiliated with a temple or the Congregation Micah, that your female clergy, Shana Mackler, Tracy Fishmine, and myself are all products of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, where Rabbi Dr. Balin is a tenured professor. And, you know, we are just sort of the next, the products of her teaching and of the wisdom of so many others. And this is our story as well. So because of you, we are here doing what we're doing in this community, and we're so grateful to you for that. So
thank you. Thank you. I just, to tie it all together, I will say, right, the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, and the first bat mitzvah was in 1922. And I don't think that's an accident.
Yeah.
And the proliferation of women onto boards started in the 1920s. After they got the vote in the country, they were like, why can't I, you know, be on the board of my congregation? So it starts to happen.
Love it. Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank Hadassah, NCJW, the Nashville Jewish Federation. Are there any final thoughts or questions? I know Deborah's asking in the chat if anyone has a last minute thought or question. But now, you know, in this time of quarantine, if you're looking for field trips, you can go down to Centennial Park and see the statue of the suffragists. You can wear your mask and be socially distanced, and it's a wonderful thing to do. And you can also watch 72 Steps from the National Ballet online as well. And God willing, we'll all be together for this next year's Women's Seder and many other in-person learning events. But until then, Dr. Balin, I hope that we'll get to have you in person when you come to visit your son at some point in the future. And God willing, you'll have a safe and healthy year at Vanderbilt.
Thank you. Thank you. To all of you, please be safe. Thank you for your attention. Really fun.